So my title coincides with I think the panel that began earlier today, and it's about cooperatives in the global picture. So first of all, I'm not going to, let's say, delve in depth into the crisis. I think we all know a lot about what's going on. I just want to mention a couple of points. First of all, this may be the first truly global crisis. In which sense? Before we had, for example, the 1929 crisis, and also in the 19th century, there were international crises. This means that a crisis started in a country and then was transmitted to other countries and other continents. However, it can be seen as a global crisis because of the global restructuring that we have seen in the last 20 to 30 years. First of all, for the first time in history, we have a truly global financial system that is interconnected and in which computers have been linked completely. This was done at the end of the 1990s, so about, let's say, not more than 10 to 15 years ago. And now this works 24 hours a day, every minute, every second, and it works in a loop. So what happens in the US goes immediately to Japan and then comes back. In trade, it's the same. We have developed a just-in-time system throughout chains in production and distribution. So most of the production now is done in parts and components. Mondragon is an example of that, and there are many firms linked into these chains. To give you an example, already in the mid-1990s, in the intermediate sectors, this means parts and components, but for example, steel and petrochemicals, 54% of trade was done within chains. This means that the idea that of a free market, of like independent enterprises, free pricing doesn't exist anymore. Most of the pricing is administered prices within chains. So the problem of the financial crisis started in 2007, actually was already a problem for the real economy, because everything now is interlinked, interconnected in such a way that almost immediately we can have an implosion. And this was seen in 2009. In few months, compared to the year earlier, to 2008, everything collapsed. So mergers and acquisitions was almost stalled. It went down by almost 80% worldwide. Trade went down almost by half. And of course, enterprises were financed with credits that were short-term credit and debt, and they had no liquidity, almost no stocks, and of course they shed labor massively, not only to survive, but just because it doesn't make sense to keep labor when you don't have these chains working. So this is when we see the value of cooperatives managed in a different way, let's say, being enhanced. And then from then on, I mean, of course, we had the states coming in to save the system, the financial banking system, and then the largest enterprises, like, for example, the car, the automotive sector. And then the states become loaded with debt. And then, of course, now we see the social impact, political crisis, for example, within the European Union, and fiscal crisis, not only the European Union, but, for example, in the United States. And also between the center, the political center, and the regions. Two examples is Italy and Spain. We see the national contracts being worked out since the Second World War or post-Franco era breaking down. This is clear, for example, with the Sicily region, and also between Madrid and other regions. Now, many things have been said already, so I'm going to say, I'm going to go quite faster with some points and say a little more about others. The resilience, not only of cooperatives, I am going to compare a little bit with the European Union in a couple of minutes. Actually, it's being built in advance. So it's not something that, because we talk a lot about values. Values are extremely important. But they are important in the way we build our present and our future. When we have real problems, if we haven't built in advance the mechanisms and strategies, the way of thinking and reacting, let's say, in a way that we can resist, be resilient, survive, and innovate, it may be too late. So cooperatives build trust and social capital, like other social enterprises, but they do it in such a way that they generate equality. You have heard a lot, maybe Stiglitz now has an important book coming out, but the way cooperatives work, they generate a wider equality in the community and the local territories in which they are embedded. And this means that they generate common wealth that is more equally distributed. So when the bad times come, they are able to react to that. They have a higher legitimacy to take painful decisions, also to restructure. And they can do this because beforehand, they have been not only more participatory, in which, let's say that the workers can participate, stakeholders, they can vote, but they also have what I call cross-control, monitoring, but also the way they work in committees, general assemblies, congresses. For example, Mondragon can tell you more. They have, because there are so many cooperatives, they have a 4-year congress in which they come together, and it's really like a political congress. They decide long-term strategies, but also mechanisms to share or to confront crises. So when the bad times come, they put in motion these mechanisms very quickly. And therefore, they can balance what they are doing. The information can flow more transparently. So we have this idea of the free market in which transactions are made on the basis of free and perfect information, which of course is not true. However, when we think of cooperatives where stakeholders, for example, in the worker cooperatives, have a direct involvement, they share in the benefits, they share in the management, they share the information. And this means that the information is more transparent, can circulate more widely on a real-time basis. For example, we can compare this to the small investors in conventional capital companies. Even them have a problem to access information compared to what now we call counterparties, the very wealthy, rich people. Those people have access to the information on a real-time basis, so they can decide what to do best. But even the small investors in the so-called market economy, I mean the financial sphere, they don't have the means to take the proper decisions in time. So this is also a value of cooperatives that come up with crisis. And they are also forward-looking to the long term. We say this and we repeat all the time, but there is something that perhaps we have to add more often, is that forward-looking doesn't mean looking towards benefits, growth, and so on. It also means looking to events, bad events, to prepare for bad times. And this is a value of cooperatives too, and it is shown in the way they build up reserves indivisible reserves, funds, solidarity mechanisms, and so on. So I just mentioned the funds. There are different types of funds that they build with time, whether it's good time or bad time. And this is extremely important. It is not done only to resist. It is done to be better, to innovate, and also to share more with the community as well. Because of that, they are more capable to adapt to different contexts and even to unforeseen events, like a crisis or a collapse in trade or so on. By doing that, they can cooperate with others to reinforce strategic strengths, but also to reduce weaknesses. This is questions you can put, for example, to Suma, to Mondragon, and others. They can, because they work together very tightly, they can use red lights to restructure with solidarity. It's not that they wait to have a problem, or like technology has changed and they have lost the market. They have explained with different examples that they are constantly upgrading, constantly thinking how to change, how to upgrade, how to train themselves, how to improve. And also they can come in and say, look, this is not going well, let's do something different. And this is very important. And solidarity mechanisms to manage work. Different things have been said already. You can manage work, for example, in times of crisis, with one question was about subsidies or like state unemployment benefits. That's one way. Mondragon has mentioned another, Miquel. You can use solidarity mechanisms. Bruno said about reducing salary. Miquel mentioned that also, but you can manage between free time and working time. You can also manage according to just-in-time processes. So, for example, they will earn the same, but if the economic activity has fallen, they can reduce the time they work, the hours, but also the calendar. But when the economic activity picks up, they will work more, but still receive the same money and the same benefits across the year. So there is another way in which you can share the places of work. You can have the same benefits, you can have more or less the same level of responsibility according to your skills, but go to have another job in another cooperative that, let's say, in which the sector is still doing well. And this is very important. For example, an MP, a European parliamentary who is the head of the Greens from Germany, was surprised by this because he said, in Germany, we have spent lots of money to keep German people as workers, although not working in the company, because of this just-in-time process and the chains, global chains. So when the economy picks up, they are there to produce or to do, let's say, provide the services. And therefore, we are competitive and we don't have to look, because if we waste time, we are out of the chains. And you have done it without any state subsidies, just by yourself. Now, we compare this to the EU. Unfortunately, the EU has not been forward-looking enough. So we see a loss of autonomy and timing in the responses to the crisis, and also they are at a loss, they are lost in the face of shocks and external events. For example, I told you there has been a globalization in the stock markets. Most of the EU stock markets have been bought by US stock markets, so they are in a chain. When the crisis came, they could not close. For example, in the US, the Russians, they can close immediately, say, okay, this is falling, it is an external event, it is a shock, we need to close, because otherwise we have a catastrophe, and there is no need, because this is something which is something external. is not rational, so we need to close. In Europe, it was difficult to do that. The IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standards, they are replacing the old accounting. The EU has accepted this even before seeing the texts, and they are in a minority voting. If we think of a cooperative, I mean, you say, okay, I take the responsibility, but I also participate in the control. They haven't done that. Because of that, this was done in 2002. Many texts have come afterwards, but they gave like a blank check. And so now they don't want to, let's say, it's difficult for them to stop this for being applied to European companies, and even they want to apply them to cooperatives. What has the United States done? They are the most important leaders in this process. But when the crisis came, they stopped. They said, okay, fine, but we have a crisis, we don't apply it. And of course they said, we are not going to apply to cooperatives. And this is the United States. I mean, I'm not talking of a small country. So in a way, we see that the EU has not been forward-looking into their own processes. And with time, we see, unfortunately, a growing internal divergence without appropriate compensatory institutions. So they have a globalization fund, they have some funds. But this is, let's say, it's like to share in the benefits, but not in the bad times, like cooperatives do. So they did not prepare for that. There was already increasing divergence. If you see the studies, there was an apparent growing convergence among countries before the crisis. But the studies showed that there was a growing internal divergence already within each country. This is the question of equality, even in Germany. But much of this apparent convergence was funded with debt, unfortunately. And lots of this was off the balance sheet. With the IFRS, as they changed the text, they did not foresee this, and they have to put this on the balance sheets of the states. And then with the crisis, now this is coming to the fore, and the pressures on the state debts of the different countries, and the pressures between, let's say, the more, now they are seeing like a good savings, let's say, forward-looking Nordic countries compared to the others, then you see these political pressures building up, and they don't know how to manage, because they did not build in advance common funds to deal with the crisis, or EU bonds, or a good common monitoring. And then now, in the crisis, they depend on individual leadership, whether Merkel or from France or from England or from other countries. And of course, short-termism prevails over the long-term interests. And we see this building up, whether electoral pressures or the banking sector or speculative pressures from the so-called the market, and prevailing over the long-term interests. So it's very nice to have a Nobel Prize and to remember the good old values and peace, solidarity, I mean a common interest, but when we have a real crisis, we see if this is resilient or not. And when we see that cooperatives are resilient, it's because many generations have really struggled and built mechanisms. So it's not only a question of values. Values are essential, but it's not only values. And these people are resilient because they have the mechanisms and the strategies to survive. So of course I'm not going to go into this. A lot, you know the consequences, common currency, the loss of competitiveness. I mean, Greece needed a debt restructuring at the very beginning. I mean, if they couldn't pay then, they can pay less now. I mean, everybody knows that beyond 60%, that's why the Maastricht, they decided that 60% of GDP. I mean, nobody ever in the world has paid beyond that. So whether now they are discussing 120% compared to 160%, it's very nice, but it doesn't make sense. I mean, everybody knows they will not be able to repay. So this is like a cooperative. I mean, the red lights should have come earlier and to say, stop. and now restructure. Because the more you wait, the more painful it will be for everybody. And then austerity policies. Actually, the austerity policies that we see now, the restructuring, was designed before. If you see the Wim Kok reports in 2005, or the industries now being privatized. And so we get all major actors in the economy highly indebted, and of course they need to deleverage. They need to get rid of assets, sell, or privatize. If it is a state, the pressures mount. They cannot then invest in social services and so on. And of course, if you have lack of transparency, that will increase the mistrust. So the question is that to see that the market, and this is something we have to detach ourselves, whether we call it capitalism, whatever we like to call it, just detach. It's not important to discuss what we call it. What is important is how it behaves and how it, let's say, delivers to the people, how it generates the common wealth that we need for the present and the future in a sustainable manner. So the question is how we build the market. And cooperatives can start markets. We know, I mean, cooperatives respond to market failures. So you can just go ahead and build up new services and respond to the emerging problems. The challenge comes many times from vested interests, like, of course, there are interests that are strong and that have conduced to the misallocation of resources through, for example, debt mechanisms or like bubbles. And then, because it seems that it has a very strong growth, then everybody wants to be there. And then we misallocate our resources because everybody goes there, we build a very nice bubble, and then when it bursts, we all lose. I say like Ulysses and the mermaids, you know, like they call you, come here, and then, you know, you get drowned. However, I think it's nice to be aware also of what conventional enterprises are doing now. Because the vested interests tells us, like the mermaids, be more like us, come to the stock market, become a conventional capital enterprise. However, if you go and study, follow up what conventional enterprises are doing now, it's actually they're doing the opposite. They are becoming more social. They are going into corporate social responsibility. They are giving more saying to the workers. They are coming out of the stock market, precisely the opposite of what some people are calling you to. Why? Because the stock markets are not delivering profits, wealth. They are becoming extremely volatile with the fast trading machines. So they are having more problems in terms of like legal problems, juridical problems, controls, risk, systemic risk. And therefore, it's also interesting to be open to see what the others are doing. And just a final slide, some points that I think we need to do more research, more debates about how cooperatives can contribute now to very important and key problems for the future. First thing, equality. A little bit more equality will give us back growth in a more sustainable manner, not predatory manner, not bubble-making form. If you have a little bit more equality, we can have, again, consumption without people getting indebted. If we have a little bit more health benefits, people will not fall indebted when they get sick. Half of the subprime problems was people investing in the US in the housing market because they don't have health benefits. Health is extremely, and it's private mainly, and it's extremely expensive. So what do? They invest in bricks to be able to repay when they are old. For example, if they have an operation, if they need a health service. So if we have a little bit more equality, we'll be more bubble-free. And also in terms of the vulnerable, the young, the old, the unemployed, the discriminated, even the migrants. If you can put the question, you can have some Raiffeisen people from Desjardins, the strong banking and financial group in Quebec, in Canada, Raiffeisen from Germany. For example, we heard today from, in history, the professor in history from Slovenia. In the beginning, why these cooperatives or these systems were invented, were created? Because of indebtedness. Because the farmers at that time, the majority of the population, were falling prey to indebtedness, to the loan sharks, and then they would lose everything, the means, the land, and they would have either to emigrate to other parts, even to put in danger their nation, or let's say the identity that they had at that time. In terms of risk, if we could have a more balanced type of enterprise, like cooperatives, if we can build good cross controls, monitoring, balances within institutions, maybe we will have less systemic risk, and we will not suffer as we do with these constantly repeating bubbles and then destruction of wealth across the board. We need this not because it's nice to participate, but it's nice to have all points of view to limit the risk we are taking or that we are building. In terms of growth, forward-looking, cooperatives can be important in 2 points. In developed countries, 2/3 of growth is done in the non-tradable sector. This means services mainly, things that are not exported, that remain within the country, the territory. Cooperatives, as we have seen, are very important actors in the service sector. Social services, they can be very good in schooling, in schools, in health services, other types of social services. In technology, they can provide, let's say, information technology solutions. They can be active in the non-tradable, also being part of these new, like also sustainable energies, renewable energies, and so on. And in the tradable sector, the goods and services that can be exported, we know that Europe, many countries, not Germany, but many countries have a big problem in terms of SMEs. The SMEs are very good, for example, in Italy, in France, but they are not good in exporting. Cooperatives can give them scales, necessary scales to export, and also they can build their competitiveness in terms of sharing and scaling advantages, research, support, innovation, and so on. And then the cooperatives, they have built a long-term equity, long-term patient capital. So this is one of the key aspects why the mermaids, I call them mermaids, but I mean like the global consulting companies try to attract now cooperatives to them and say, look, why don't you go into acquisitions? Because they are not indebted. They're one of the last big chunk of the global economy that can go and acquire, but also can invest in the future. And this means thinking about energy, new energy and the service economy, and also finance, new finance. We need these three things to solve the crisis. No other crisis has gone through without a new transportation and new energy system. It was the trains, the cars, and now we will need something different. So this is very important, the service economy, because everything is going on to services. Even if it is not a service, it is turning the accounting as a service. Even work is being accounted as a service unit. So cooperatives have really to participate and rethink this very carefully. And also the tension between banking and private equity. For different reasons, money flows are going to private hands. Private funds, private equity, sovereign wealth funds, and so on. So we need to think financial instruments that are appropriate to the cooperative identity. And final but not least, two small things: commons monitoring and efficient alignment implementation. Cooperatives are criticized for wrong reasons. but they are efficient in terms of implementation and in terms of monitoring. And by doing this, the costs are really much lower than conventional capital enterprises. Ostrom, you know, Elinor Ostrom, who was a Nobel Prize in Economics, 2009, in his book of 1990, Governing the Commons, she worked on the global commons and then like natural resources and common goods. And she mentioned cooperatives as one of the forms that could take, let's say, a way to sustain the economy, to grow, but in a sustainable manner. So we don't deplete our resources, we don't deplete our wealth. And then the efficient alignment implementation is because if you have all the stakeholders and workers participating in a responsible manner, when we say, oh, it takes a lot of time to decide things, how do you do that? It takes a bit more time. But if the culture allows, because sometimes cultures can be a bit chaotic and rebelling and so on, but if you manage to let's say, stick to your decisions, the alignment implementation of the interest of the stakeholders and the participative members have been done at the top, let's say, at first. So the implementation will follow more naturally. Conventional enterprises have the opposite problems. They decide up, let's say, very quickly, whatever they like. But then they have a problem in implementing and monitoring because the others don't want to implement that, because it's against their interest most of the time. So cooperatives can do this in a very efficient manner. Well, I'm finished. Thank you.